Hi there. I just remembered that you are going to sit for your exams in economics, and I thought this video might just help you to remember a few things, basic principles about economics. First, no argument is absolutely wrong or right in economics. In fact, all arguments are right. It just depends on how logical your answer is. In the sense that when you are making an argument, you must build a chain of events, and the chain of events must lead you somewhere, so you can make a certain conclusion. Now, what makes an argument wrong is when the argument fails to be logical. That is, in the chain of events, there is a break, there is a gap, and therefore you do not end with the correct conclusion. So remember that no argument is wrong. In fact, all arguments are actually right. It just depends. You notice that I am mentioning the word "it depends" almost every time, and I'm using it as a magic phrase because that's how essentially you should make your arguments, to give it a 360 balance. For example, if you are to argue for increased interest rates or against increased interest rates, let's say that's what has happened in an economy, and you are to argue whether it's good for the economy or bad for the economy, well, your intuition might be to say that increasing interest rates is bad for the economy. Then you have to make a logical chain of events. So you might want to say that if interest increase, there is a possibility of people's incomes reducing because they're not able to borrow from the banks as the cost of borrowing has gone up, and that may reduce their ability to buy goods and services, which may reduce demand and essentially reduce prices. There is a logical chain of events. And if prices reduce, then you have dealt with inflation. That is a positive thing. You have argued positively for the increased interest rates. You might also argue against that same policy and say, well, if you increase the interest rates, you are likely to see a situation where the increased interest rates leads to increased costs of borrowing for the farms, which means increased cost of production, which may also mean that the prices go up because farms have to recover their costs. That makes inflation worse. Same thing, you're still arguing about inflation, but you see you end up with two conclusions. One, it's good for the economy. Two, it's bad for the economy. Then the magic phrase comes in. You realize, okay. So then, whatever argument I made must depend on something. And you might notice, okay, it seems that if the inflation that we are trying to deal with was caused by increased cost of production, that is, it was a cost push inflation, then increasing the interest rates is not a good solution. But if the inflation was demand pull inflation, then increasing the interest rates was a good policy. So then, in your argument, you say, it depends on the type of inflation. So the addition of that magic phrase after you have argued for interest rates, gives you a better, examination of the policy by giving it a balanced view, what is called a 360 balance, looking at the ultimate effect, but also considering that it's not always the case. So mentioning something like it also depends on what caused the inflation and maybe the extent to which the prices have also increased, because also if the costs of production, yes, increase because you have increased the interest rates, it also depends by how much the prices will increase. So the elasticity comes in. So I am trying to remind you that the magic phrase, it depends, is what you need when you're making arguments to give your arguments a balanced view. So you make arguments and you start thinking, is my argument always true? Very important question. After you have argued for or against, or you've made the two arguments, what does it depend on for anyone to conclude either the positive one or the negative one? Okay. Sorry. Okay. So it depends. And there are a few things that you can always put in mind that happen to be the elements that come after the phrase. Mostly, time is an important aspect in any economic situation. So it depends on short-term, long-term. It depends on elasticities, the extent to which maybe the taxes were increased. So the extent, the amount. It depends with the extent to which prices increased. That is elasticities of price based on maybe change of demand, change of supply. So the extent. So when you want to answer the question of, to bring in the idea of it depends, consider thinking about long-term and short-term. Consider thinking about the amount of change, whether it is increasing taxes, by how much did the taxes increase, so that if they increase by a big amount, maybe the policy doesn't work or it works. The amount. If you talk about prices, you still talk about the amount of change. But for prices, we are very specific. We mention price elasticity, because price elasticity, it is a change of prices with regards to either change in demand or change in supply. So always consider those elasticities, the amount of tax, the amount of subsidies, if it's such a policy, the amount of tariff, So having a tariff is not always bad. It's not always good for a country or for whatever economic situation there is. But the extent, the amount of tax, the amount of that tariff is also important to be considered. If it's about labor, you're talking about labor, for example, how skilled they are is an important qualitative issue to think about. Okay, if it's about any expenditure, you may want to think about the alternative of spending, which is opportunity cost. Okay, if the government is, for example, building a certain infrastructure, what is the opportunity cost of using the money to build that infrastructure? Maybe by building that elaborate transport system, are we missing the opportunity to provide a health service. Okay, there are things which are also important things to consider. Qualitative issues like the political will. Are the leadership, the people at the helm of leading the country or the treasury or the economy willing to make the change or to make the policy? How about the culture of the people? Okay, if you propose a change in taxation, what effect does it have on people's working culture? Are they likely to opt to work less? So all these policies, the magic phrase of "it depends on this," because this could mean this other thing, is important to add to your arguments for you to have a balanced 360 argument. I felt like I needed to say those things just to remind you that your arguments need to be balanced, and always remember that part, because most of the questions you're going to meet will ask you, consider whether, to what extent, okay, evaluate. So when you're evaluating, you must give that balanced view. How you do that is by bringing in "it depends on these other factors."